Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to see you today. My name is Dustin Cormier, and this is another episode of How to Rock Astrology. I'm very excited today to be having my friend Sachin from SearchinSachin Astrology joining us to talk about the elusive Rahu and Ketu. Thank you so much for joining me today, Sachin.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very, very excited to have you here, Sachin. Now, Sachin is somebody who has gone through the same rigorous training that I did through Ryan Kirksack's program, Asheville Vedic Astrology. You went through the 4 years and you've gotten your certificate. And now I'm very glad to be hanging out with you here as a fellow student, talking about essentially what we've learned from our own course. And as well, since you and I have both graduated, we've both petered off a little bit into our own understandings of the basic foundational knowledge we got from that course. So, as you and I talked about in the beginning, something that might be a good intention for us to set is that our interest here is to do our best to convey the heart and knowledge of Jyotish. This video is in service to the spirit of Jyotish insofar as we are capable of conveying that. And I'm very excited to do our best to do that, Sachin. Every astrologer comes from a different place, but if the intention is the shared heart of Jyotish, then I think that we can at least have a mutual intention to abide by.
Absolutely.
So I'm very excited for it, Sachin. For those who are interested and who enjoy this talk and want to see a little bit more of Sachin, you can find Sachin on his website, www.SearchinSachin.com. That's Searchin, Searchin, and then Sachin, SACHIN.com. Now, me and Sachin have for the last little bit, we were talking about how we wanted to unfold this presentation. Sachin, one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you on here is because you have a very firm way of presenting your etymology and your understanding of anything through knowledge given in the rational way that most Jyotish operates on. There's a real rational and foundational understanding of Rahu and Ketu. And one of the reasons I've invited you on here is because, I love to chat a little bit about it. We're going to do that in the intro so that my Western audience can see what it is that we're talking about. And of course, what we're talking about is the north and south nodes. This is the language that the Western astrologers use for these symbols of Rahu and Ketu. And I appreciate that you have a rational mode in the way that you go about conveying information. So I'm very glad to have you on here and do that with me, Sachin. Now, what I figured we would do is we could talk a little bit at first about our understanding at a sort of loose way of the nature of Rahu and Ketu. And then from there, once people have an appreciation of where we're going to get into some more guts with a presentation that Sachin has prepared for us. So, thanks again for hanging out with me here, Sachin.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight. The past half an hour, 1 hour of our conversation has been so insightful in so many ways.
Very enlightening, just chatting,
Yeah.
But I'm glad that we get to share our sparking of consciousness with our audience. It's funny, me and Sachin, before we started, we've just realized that we both have the moon in Sagittarius.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that we're both very expansive, but we still try to move within the grammatical correctness implied by Sagittarius and its ruler Jupiter. So now, everybody, this is where we're going to begin talking about Rahu and Ketu. That is the north and south nodes. of astrology. Sachin and I are both what we would call tropical Vedic astrologers. And so this presentation is indeed, it's tinged with what I would call Jyotish roots. That's the Vedic Indian astrology roots. Now, one of the points that I wanted to make before we began is that as we talked about Sachin, it would seem that Westerners, they seem to be missing out on much of the mythos and much of the practical understanding of what the nodes are. There are many reasons for this. Simply one of them being that it seems to me that in Indian and Jyotish literature, Rahu and Ketu are really given centrally at the beginning of many of Parashara, for example, through the mythos that are given in the Vedas, which we're going to talk about various of those mythoses. Many of the creation stories of Indian literature, including Varaha, the boar. Many of these creation stories involve inherently at their root an understanding of Rahu and Ketu and what the nodes mean to the soul and what they mean in astrology. Really, the Vedas are much more than astrology. So it would be correct really to say that the nodes in the eclipses are really saying something about the soul that's given even in the Vedic literature before what we would call the astronomical medieval literature of astronomy in Indian literature. So Rahu and Ketu are considered as being very important in the Indian tradition of astrology. And that's the nodes, like I said. Now, one of the things that me and Sachin were pondering on, it's this idea that not only is the West missing out on the roots of Vedic literature that talk about the nodes in the mythos of the nodes, but it's our opinion, as we were sort of discussing, that what I kind of said is that the West has become so fascinated with dessert that it kind of forgot to eat lunch in a way. And what I mean by this is that the Westerners have a great emphasis of the outer planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Now, I think it's important to state that I certainly agree that an understanding of the outer planets in the West will be much stronger once we first understand what Rahu and Ketu are conveying in astrology, because Rahu and Ketu have so much to do with the guts of astrology. Westerners really overlook the north and south nodes. They almost treat it as another outer planet in a way. And in my interpretation, the Saptagrahas, it's the first 7 planets, plus Rahu and Ketu, are the primary arbiters of our electromagnetic field. They're primary arbiters of the Panchatattvas, the 5 elements, and the physical embodiment, as well as spiritual and metaphysical embodiment of everything that we are. In my opinion, me speaking as somebody who is also steeped in the Western tradition, I would say that the outer planets are interesting arbiters of a real, what, in the West we call it a bigger collective generational karma. I often like to say that there are so many cosmoses with so many galaxies with planets that could be possibly growing human consciousness. But no matter what, in whatever cosmos human consciousness grows, there will always be the Saptagrahas and the lunar nodes of the Vedas. These are a universal, what I call a perennial phenomenon that will always be there wherever human consciousness is. We have our 5 limbs, and we have everything in our bodies that is just conveyed by those Saptagrahas. The outer planets could be, as I understand it, an extra limb of the specific karma of this galaxy. And perhaps in many different galaxies, there are other galaxies with other outer planets that make it slightly different than ours. So the outer planets are variable, but what is primary to every human experience in every galaxy is the saptagrahas and the nodes of Rahu and Ketu. That's me going on a little bit of a real my intuitive grasp on the situation as a Western astrologer who has become steeped in Jyotish. The main point to get at here is that in Jyotish, in Vedic literature, Rahu and Ketu are not something that is in the same vein as the outer planets. They are something that is really a primary fulcrum for the evolutionary narrative of the soul. Now, Sachin, do you want to add anything to that before I go on to our next point?
Yeah, that's just perfect, because as you touched upon the fact that the Western tradition takes the nodes of the moon as just the nodes of the moon. There's not much clarity on that, even when they try to look at the Vedic astrologers. Because of the whole sidereal tropical issue, they're not able to really access the nodes in the way they'd like to, interpretations as such. And then we also have the nodes being treated like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the outer planets. And the Western tradition has been using that in various ways. And Vedic astrology comes, especially Jyotisha, not just like Indian astrology with its symbolism, astronomical soundness, and overall precision, is just tackling the whole solar system, the whole sun system, as a completely different theme. It's not only just symbolic. And finally, as you said, it's literal while being symbolic. It's also a lot of literal stuff. So we have this whole system of medical astrology, which has its own issues in India, of like whole calculation blunders and stuff, and that's why it cannot be used for medicine as such at its current level of consciousness. So that's a whole new conversation. And then finally, as you said, it's Rahu and Ketu being the evolutionary or the devolutionary axis itself, while and the whole process is not that sun being the witness consciousness at all times. It's the sun's bonding with earth and moon's bonding with earth, and sun and moon collectively creating this karmic bond. And you can see astronomically how this bond is formed. That entanglement itself is studied by the sense of time that we get comes from Rahu and Ketu.
Certainly.
The circadian rhythms are coming from sun and moon, but the fact that there is a past and there will be a future, like there has literally been a past where, like karmically, as we see like in high yogic studies, that one can remember their previous lifetimes and deep meditation and stuff, all that stuff, like the literal fact that one has in its own like way, not like literal fact in the sense of the scientific sense, but like yogic scientific way. It's that's Ketu, that past, the historic karmic past, which is the south node of the moon. There's a cultural psyche, like Indian psyche, so the moon of India, and the historic past of India is in its Ketu. And the pull that it has from an unknown source, and so a pull from an unknown source with a push from a known past of Ketu, that's Rahu. Right? While sun is always being a witness, sun's purpose is to not engage with all of this, But as we know, sun, the soul itself, the Atman, is currently entangled in this drama
From our perspective on Earth.
from our perspective. So once one is self-realized, one can see the whole play going on. So the self-realized being has not gotten rid of their karma. They've just become completely aware of all of it.
And they can allow the play to happen from a detached, objective perspective in the soul.
And loving, compassionate, courageous. So when there's a need for courage, one is courageous through their Mars. When one needs to be wise while engaging with their karma, they use their Jupiter. But everything is being used at a higher capacity, and one is engaging with all of their karmic material in a much more conscious fashion. While sun is just wanting to always be the witness, what we call Sakshi, like the Sakshi Bhav, we call it, like the motivation of being the witness, but not just this detached, narcissistic sort of intellectual grasping of detachment, but a literal compassionate, loving embrace of reality, of accepting everything and not wanting to fix. So when we come from the astrology that we come from, we see errors in the chart that we need to fix. Once one is self-realized to a certain degree, one sees there's not much to fix. There's just difficult situations, seemingly difficult situations that need to be engaged with consciously.
This is why Paramahansa Yogananda was big on the phrase self-realization, because it's simply by realizing that the self is all of these phases, you can let go of the attachment to any particular phase, and therefore let go really of the fluctuations of consciousness. This is what Patanjali tells us.
Exactly. And then the real process of real enlightenment begins.
Certainly.
So at self-realization, one has just become a sadhak. Which is interesting. It's later on in the process of source realization. The source of the self itself is the spiritual stuff. So
and
here
with
why, Jyotisha, we are just working with time and space and self. So we're just working with that. We start with just the lagna. We start with just the physical body. Then we ground ourselves in our moon. We become more psychological beings, and we start understanding our persona, our personas of others, shadows, Rahu and Ketu material. Where is this person coming from? What's their ancestral history of their family?
And their specific soul.
Of the specific psyche. And then we have the sun entangling into the whole process. Then we get realization into the fact that we are just not this body-mind based, that is earth, lagna, and bhavas and Chandra based beings, but we have this objective I amness to us, and we can witness all the processes within the solar system. And then we leave the solar system. That process, that is beyond time. That's when Jyotish stops functioning.
Very psychedelic, as I like to say.
Trippy stuff.
yeah, that's that. I love it, man. That's my era for sure. But with stuff like this, it's really just like all of the great stuff in astrology and Indian literature. It's timeless.
Yeah.
So for everybody who's watching, it's important for us to consider that there is a symbolic. It's useful for us to abide by symbolic consciousness when trying to deal with astrology. But it's also very useful to deal with it in a rational, pragmatic sense. And Indian literature has given us much pragmatism in regards to what the North and South nodes are doing. The Western consciousness doesn't have that same literature, and so it symbolizes the nodes as being something is less central than it really ought to. Now, one of the things I've written in this introduction is that, in a way, all that we understand of the planets, the houses, the aspects between planets, yogas, vargas, dashas, all the things that we really know in astrology, they really have as their purpose, they are pawns in the evolutionary narrative of Rahu and Ketu's unfoldment of the wholeness of the self, which is essentially being abided by the sun and the moon. really Rahu and Ketu are very central players in the evolutionary narrative, where we have fluctuations in our integration of what the sun is trying to do. How I've kind of said it is that, you've mentioned that the planets in the houses, the house cusps, these are essentially essential capacities in the self that are kind of fixed, and they're all really just what they are. They are our capacities. The movement of the soul through time is the influx of the nodes of Rahu and Ketu, because we can't understand ourselves without the context of an experience. So this is why we have Rahu periods where we are plunged into a darkness, plunged into a pressure that gives us the glory of what is given in the rest of the planets in astrology. Rahu is a certain type of pressure of desire, and I would almost call Ketu a certain pressure of realism. You mentioned, so I would say through Rahu, we are disillusioned about the compulsiveness of our desires. And through that compulsion, through Rahu, we find out what are our actual desires that have seeds of the sun in them. Ernst Wilhelm does a great consciousness of Rahu and Ketu, where he talks about Ketu as being a fortress, and Rahu is sort of a planetary, Ketu is the defending planetary army of our fortress. Rahu is the outgoing search party that is looking for more expansion of the territory of what the self is. And sometimes we can send our search party off into a place that has nothing to do with the soul. But by doing that, we find out, we get closer to what the soul is, what the sun is actually trying to do. Now, I've made a little bit of a metaphor here to kind of convey what exactly we're getting at here. And it's this metaphor that I've described of the scavenger in the forest. Do you mind if I go into this a little bit, Sachin, before we do our presentation? Thank you, my friend. So the idea here is, now let's say that anybody is having, let's say that you have Rahu conjunct a planet or deeply involved and entangled with a graha in one's natal chart. That means that this narrative of Rahu is probably going to be going on through one's whole life. But even a person who is, we could also say that about somebody who's born close to an eclipse. And we can also say this about somebody who's coming into a Rahu period, a Rahu Mahadasha. So this is kind of like this scavenger in a forest. You're inside this little hut inside of a forest, and you want to find out what is good for you, what fruits will sustain you and will guide you to have the energy that you need to do what you want to do your yoga inside of your hut, to do what you want to do with your life, and essentially embody the sun, embody the best of what is given through the sun and all the other grahas and all the other planets. This person's inside their hut, and they decide that they want to go outside the hut, outside the fortress, and find various fruits and vegetables and nuts in order to eat. So they go out and they find 100 varieties of fruits, nuts, seeds, and even animals. Then they come back, and this is the Rahu experience of a big expansive compulsion out into the unknown. And when you come back, you've got 100 different types of food. You sit down and your eyes are bigger than your belly. This is very much descriptive of Rahu. And what happens? We bring it in. We eat all these different varieties of fruits and nuts and seeds. Some of them are poisonous. Some of them are actually not conducive to our greatest health. Some of them are just undigestible. Some of them are just do not have any real nutriment in them. And really, what usually happens with most people is that you go out to get 100 types of food and you only end up finding 10 that your body actually agrees with, let's say. Okay. So this is the Rahu phase. It's the fluctuation of bearing out into the unknown, because there's a compulsion in the soul where it doesn't know exactly what it needs in its earth experience in order to embody the fullness of the sun. So you go out, you get 100 things, you come back, you only get 10, which means a huge amount of the time that you spent was wasted. You even got some toxic berries that you ingested trying to find the good stuff, but you end up finding 10. So the yogi, the person on the path in life, says, these 10 items, these 10 fruits, I can go, I know what they look like now. I can go out and I can pick, this was an apple that I ate and it was good for me. This was a carrot that grew here. This was good for me. Now I can go out and I can see it all the time. So as time goes on, the person inside the hut now has 10 things to expand itself through. This is when the Ketu phase starts to move in. Eventually, the person says, okay, these are the only 10 that I have. This is the life that I have. Ketu is an experience of letting go of the compulsion to want more. You only got 10. So don't go swirling in your head being upset that you only have 10. Don't go swirling in your head that you're upset that this is the life that you have to live. Ketu pushes us to an experience of feeling that you can get through life really having what you feels like not enough, but it is realistically letting go of the compulsion of the mind and settling into the realistic karma that your soul is set out for you. Now, of course, Rahu and Ketu come in phases. Over time, the Ketu phase is where the person begins to experience that at least I've got those 10. I've got my 10 fruits. Now I don't need to search anymore. Now I can come within and embody the yoga and the life that I want to live. Eventually, the person starts to feel like the 10, once again, is good, but maybe there's more. Rahu then once again comes into effect. And this is where we say, okay, now I know what the 10 good vegetables and fruits and seeds are. I'm going to go out and find more. But now I know what to look for. So the next Rahu phase, the person goes out and looks for another 100 fruits. They go out and they see that this one is kind of like those seeds that I had. This one is kind of like those carrots that I had. This one is like this. And they're recognizing what is the nature of their essence, of what will actually get them the best thing. Because in the Ketu phase, they burned it in there and they know what they really realistically need. But there's more varieties of what the soul needs out there in the world. So when Rahu comes again, they get another 100 fruits and vegetables. They bring it back to the hut. And once you know it, now they've found that about 25 of the 100 varieties that they sought this time, 25 of them are useful, are digestible, are giving you expansive capacities to go further and progress in that essential sun that you had found in the center. Because ultimately Rahu has glimmers of the sun. You're going to waste a lot. You're going to lose a lot of time and energy seeking the 25 things that you do need. But once you have the 25 things that you need through Rahu, then the time is come to ultimately expand on your heart, on your sun, on your heart, on that deepest Atman nature that is inside you. The Rahu phase, though it was difficult, has given you more opportunities to expand on the essential self that the sun is. And of course, when Ketu comes again, you realize that 25 is all you need. So once you can let go of the need for more than the 25 things, the Ketu phase comes in and says, all right, now what are you going to do with it? And how are you going to make the best out of it? So Sachin, this is the metaphorical story that I did want to unfold in regards to what Rahu and Ketu are all about. Now, did you have any thoughts with regards to how I brought this particular metaphor up?
Yeah, it's what tells us essentially that existence is not cyclical. If it has become cyclical, it's a state of it's not a healthy state. It's a repetitive state. Even a habit, no matter how disciplined one is, one improves upon their habits.
Mhm.
So if you wake up at 6 one day with more struggle, the next day you wake up with lesser struggle, and the next day you have no struggle, and after that you probably don't even need your alarm clock. So there is no cyclicality, there's no circles in existence. There's spirals that move up, spirals that move down,
Wonderful.
spirals that move sideways. So this tells us that how the communication between Rahu and Ketu, which is the unconscious karmic material, it has nothing to do with experience. It doesn't experience anything. It's just this unconscious store of karmic material which sets the road. It's just the road that we take,
Mhm.
right?
Wonderful.
The
That's a good way to
experiencing
put it.
planets are just sun and moon. Only sun and moon can see. Jupiter can't see, Venus can't see, Mars can't see, Saturn can't. They can't see.
Mm.
They see through. They are just capacities. They're elements. They're things that are physically present. Right. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Yep, that makes
This is
sense to
what
me,
makes
Sachin.
it makes spiralic, and this is what makes Rahu and Ketu so significant, because that's the essential shadow work that we have to do. And it's so subtle. Like the games that we play with Rahu and Ketu are subtle beyond perception. You'll be really surprised. Like once you start digging into your Rahu Ketu material, you'll be terrified by the kind of motivations and kind of things that you do, and the
Certainly.
kind of perceptions that we have, and the kind of automated suggestions that we have from the unconscious. Like, why did um, it just happened? When people say, like, I don't know why I did it, it just happened to me. I
That's
just
right.
happened to be here. I just happened to move to a new country. I just happened to be with this person, or I just happened to be here or there. It's just all Rahu Ketu material.
Mm.
Now, the most drastic changes happen because of Rahu and Ketu. That's why eclipses are extremely significant. Any massive shift in anyone's life, any superbly surprising story in anyone's life, and if you see anyone doing something very extreme with their planets, they probably have that planet with Rahu or Ketu.
Mm.
Especially if it's outwardly extreme, usually it's Rahu.
Right.
Ketu is not that extreme.
Yeah.
Like, for example,
Internally.
Elon Musk has Rahu and Mars. And the thing that he wants to do is he wants to colonize Mars. He has Rahu and Mars together.
Mm. Yeah,
So
it's
you see
interesting.
that, right? So he wants to expand his territory into Mars. Like he wants to go all the way there.
That's
In
that's very interesting.
right, and
Mars is
it's
such an earthy planet and it grips what it can. So it's literally gripping another Earth.
exactly, and it's literal also, because it's literally Mars planet itself that he wants to go to,
Right. Wow.
right? And so yeah, there's an exoteric uh, manner these symbols can be contextualized in, and there's
Mm.
an esoteric manner,
Mm.
and they both have their own both import.
And I think it's important for just for me to make sure that I'm gripping the really yogic transmission that you're giving here. I often think of the fact that the enlightened person, as they say, is somebody who has ended the fluctuations of consciousness. This is what Patanjali gives us in his Yoga Sutras. Yoga is seizing the fluctuations in consciousness. Now,
Yeah,
what's interesting is that I often think of it as like a person at sea. And we can see that, let's say there's an enlightened person in a sailboat, and then there's a regular person in this sailboat. The enlightened person there's a storm comes and the waves are coming up and down, and it throws them way off course. And the enlightened person understands that internally you can be still, while Rahu and Ketu make fluctuations, give opportunities, give necessary karmas, give things that have to be dealt with that are painful sometimes. Sometimes they're difficult, and you don't want to act too much on these compulsions. The enlightened yogi sees the waves as being another expression of the waveless. Whereas one who is not so enlightened is going to experience those same waves, but they're going to identify with the waves, and they're going to be fearful that this happened, and they're going to be, let the compulsions wrench them from their essential sense of center. Whereas the enlightened person would is still experiencing Rahu and Ketu just like we are, but there's a detachment involved.
It's the solar perspective and the lunar perspective. It's basically that moon is to be the vritti, yogas chitta vritti nirodha. The first sutra, second sutra itself is that vritti is that moon.
Wow.
The moon itself has to be deleted. And when moon is deleted, we stop in attuning with all the grahas.
Right.
So that's why the process is always inward. So you stop smelling, tasting, touching, hearing, and seeing, which is the 5 planets. And they cease. The moon has to settle down. And the moon, when it settles down, when it's silenced, the sun starts being reflected into the moon, and it goes into a sense of integration with the sun. And then the sun meditates upon itself.
Wonderful.
So it stops, it doesn't know that it is meditating. It is meditation. Right? So it's not like I am meditating. If I am meditating, then moon is meditating. There is only I amness in that state. Right? So the whole one is that state of yoga, sun being number 1, as stated by Parashara, and moon being 2. So moon is the division of the sun.
Duality.
So it's that duality. It is that
the experience of duality.
It's the relativity of the psyche, cultural relativity, where you grew up, your choices, your conditioning, your preferences, all
your personality
work, the personality being the uppermost layer. And then there's the personality is essentially the persona, what you show to the world, what we are right now.
Certainly.
And then what we are when we have no inhibitions, what we are in dream states. That's where the persona is not there at all. Then you find yourself doing all kinds of deranged stuff in a dream. And that's your unconscious mind. That's the unconscious aspects of the moon. So those dreams are not you. They are the undercurrents of your own moon when your persona, your inhibitions have been removed. And when you are not sort of in your control, like you cannot have that force of the sort of the barricading of the unconscious. The moment that's removed, you're in a dream state. And dream state, you find yourself murdering people, getting murdered, chasing animals, killing them, doing all kinds of weird stuff for some people. For some people, they're helping people and they're compensating in different ways. They're feeling helpless in their real life, and they're helping many animals, many people in their dreams. And so that's the unconscious. And then we have the Rahu Ketu source, which is in the causal body, sort of. It's the karmic material that one has to deal with. It's
causal source.
It's all the lunar stuff happening. This has to be seized, right? This has to be packed up. So it's like with the moon silencing, the moment we silence the moon, we see like all this nonsense come up. Because the persona is not there. Like when you sit with your eyes closed, there's no one to perform to. Like, who are you going to perform for now?
Right.
You're in your own truth now. So the moment you're in your own truth, you have to fall. You have to look at yourself. The moment you have to look at yourself, first so people in the stages of meditation start freaking out. People have agitations in their body, resistances in their body. People weep, or grief that was stuck in their body from 20 years ago comes up, and they explode with tears. And some people are laughing for no reason, and they seem like crazy people to others, to non-meditators. and you see all these sort of stuff happen. It's all the psychical stuff that is repressed in the unconscious that comes up. Then your dream world becomes very active as you start preserving your energies and you start meditating more. All this stuff happens, and eventually it's the sun's perspective that is developed, and that's the journey. And that's
right,
like
because those seeds of the sun are inside of those unconscious torrents that are coming up in those moments of sleep, but there's still a projection of the mind on those essential seeds of the sun, at least until the yoga develops.
Yeah, like essentially moon is basically a distortion of the sun.
Wonderful.
It's basically that. Moon, if moon in and of itself is nothing, it doesn't exist. It's using sun's borrowed light, and it's basic fundamentally it's just connecting all the planets and the sun to earth, beings on earth,
conveying it to our earthly experience,
conveying it to making our earthly experience subjective.
Right.
It's a trap. Earth and moon are in sort of this dance with each other. So what we are supposed to do is we have to heal our moon, bring it to a nice state, and create a nice place on earth where people have enough safety. People feel safe. That's the root cause of all mental disorders, has been found to be lack of safety.
Lack of foundation.
Yeah, like literal safety, like feeling safe to express the contents, the karmic contents of your unconscious have to be safely be expressed.
It's hard
those are inhibited as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 8-year-old, and 20-year-old, 25-year-old. You start creating complexes. Wonderful. Why this happens is when Rahu and Moon are together. That's the complex. That entanglement word that I keep using, that's the entanglement that is happening between Earth, Moon, and Sun. And that's the confusion that is happening. And that's why we get and the fact that needs to be established is that there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, it's what they say, the way out is the way in, and the way in is the way out.
Yeah, like something like that. So it's so interesting
thing to convey.
I go on like tangents with this stuff.
Oh, I feel you, Sachin. But this has been a really good, concise intro for us. Now, I think our intention here was to just have a little bit of a sort of conversational introduction here. Now, I invite you, Sachin. You and I you've worked out a little bit of a presentation for us, so that we've given, especially to my Western audience, a real good sense of what a sort of almost we would call a symbolic. We're working through the Western linguistic model of a symbolic grasp of Rahu and Ketu, and especially what they mean in the context of yoga. Now, I wonder if you've made a presentation that's going to give us a little bit of Indian literature's classic mythos that the Vedas have built upon in order to convey this meaning of Rahu and Ketu. And there are a few of them. I think that the one that we centered on to talk about today is Svarbhanu, if I'm not mistaken. Now, I'm thinking, Sachin, that we can start moving towards your presentation. Is there anything else that you'd like to convey before we start doing that?
I think let's speak through the presentation. Let's utilize the presentation to guide us.
Perfect. Perfect. Please feel free, Sachin.
All right.